We now have what should be, I think, a very interesting session on the question of sports rights. This is something of great interest, of course, to many people, all of us who are interested in major sporting events. And I think we've assembled an excellent panel to deal with this subject. We had an excellent chair for this session as well in Ray Snoddy, but there appears to be a technical glitch. So Ray has not, at least not yet, been able to join us. So I'm doing my best to step in at rather short notice.
Thank you.
I think, oh, Ray has arrived. You're.
I'm so sorry, Colin. The usual nonsense with technology, but I'm absolutely here and raring to go. And I did hear you for a little bit. That it does seem an obscure issue for the VLV to be dealing with listed events and sports rights, but actually it could not be more important because it completely defines what average viewer can see without having to pay subscriptions, which have added up to quite a lot over the year. When you look at how things are happening with Amazon and Apple and all the big players coming into the market alongside satellite TV, you could maybe for a moment get depressed. But I can give you and everyone listening good news on this very day. The Rugby League has decided to sign a deal with Channel 4 Television. And for the first time in 25 years, Rugby League will be on terrestrial television. So clearly not all is lost. To discuss this important issue, we have an important panel today. Jack Genovese, Head of Sport at the excellent Ampere Analysis, and he's also ex-Ofcom. Even more remarkable, Barbara Slater, who was appointed Director of Sport at the BBC in 2009. Many Premier League managers would welcome that sort of longevity. She was also the award-winning person in charge of the BBC coverage of the London Olympics. And not least John Grogan, former Labour MP at Selby and Keighley, who has taken a great interest in this matter. And really, as the media bill comes forward, we can hear from him what legislative measures might have to be taken to protect the public interest and the viewer's interest. But first, to describe what this particular piece looks like, Jack Genovese.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me, and I hope you can see my screen. Hello, everyone. So I'm Jack Genovese. I'm a senior analyst at Ampere Analysis. We're a research and analytics firm based in London, and we have a focus on the media, entertainment, and gaming industries, as well as the sporting industries. I was kindly asked to kick off today's panel discussion with a short presentation, which summarized the key elements of the listed events regime in the UK and provide a brief overview of the markets to serve as context in which the discussion will take place later on. Without further ado, let's start from the fundamentals of the listed events regulatory framework in the UK, which has been in place for more than 30 years since the commercial broadcasting sector started to flourish. However, it's worth noting that listed events are not just unique to the UK, and indeed several countries in Europe, as well as around the world, notably Australia, have taken measures to ensure that some of the events, some events, predominantly sporting events, are made available to watch on television to as wide an audience as possible. So the current regulatory regime stems from the Broadcasting Act of 1996 that defines listed events as sporting events of or other events of national interest being included in a list drawn by the Secretary of State. In other words, a listed event is what the Secretary of State says a listed event is. The list can be revised by the Secretary of State at any time, but only after consultation with the BBC, with the Welsh Authority and Ofcom, as well as the rights holder of the event in question. And the current list hasn't changed much since 1998 when it was drawn. The latest change was the addition of the Paralympic Games to Group A, was approved in 2020, and a consultation on whether to expand the list further to add more women's games was held at the end of 2019, but a decision on it was delayed due to the impact of COVID on sports. So meanwhile, Ofcom has the duty to set the procedures that broadcasters who wish to broadcast listed events should follow. And among these, broadcasters who wish to show exclusive live coverage of the event must ask for Ofcom's consent to do so. Now, the criteria observed by Ofcom in its decision are set out in its code on sporting events. On sports and listed events. It's way too long for me to summarize that in a short presentation today, but the main takeaway from this introduction should be that the events that fall under the listed events regime are selected by the Secretary of State. Broadcasters independently negotiate the terms for the licensing of their rights to broadcast these events with, and they negotiate those with the relevant rights holders. Ofcom is there to make sure that the acquisition of those rights and the broadcasting of the events conform to the rules that it sets out in its code. So what are then the listed events that follow under the current list? So since 1998, there have been two groups of listed events. Group A, which include the likes of the Olympics, the Summer and Winter Olympics, the Football World Cup, the FA Cup Final, Wimbledon Final, the Grand National. These are characterized by the way in which Ofcom will generally give consent. In other words, as a general rule, live coverage of these events on a qualifying service is a required condition for Ofcom's consent. And I will touch upon what qualified service means in the next slide. But before I do so, let me introduce the Group B events, which were set up, which were introduced in 1998 themselves. They're a bit more diverse with respect to Group A. They include the likes of cricket, test matches played in England, the Cricket World Cup, the Ryder Cup, Open Golf Championship, the World Athletic Championship. And generally speaking, again, Ofcom's consent will be granted if highlights of these events are shown on a qualifying service. So what is a qualifying service? The qualifying services are broadcasting services that meet two general criteria. They must be received by 95% of the UK population. And by received, I mean that that 95% of the population can receive the signal or the data by which the platform transmits the services to their home, and that they have the necessary equipment to view those services. They also must be made available on a free-to-air basis. I mean, it might be worth noting at this point that qualifying services are not a synonym of public service broadcasters in this context, and listed events regulation was not conceived to be necessarily limited to public service broadcasters under the definition of the Communications Act. However, there is a significant overlap between public service broadcasters and qualifying services because public service broadcasters tend to meet those two criteria that I've described above. Ofcom is responsible for the identification of the services that meet those two criteria. And so BBC One, BBC Two, the whole Channel 3 network and Channel 4 have been designated as qualifying services since Ofcom's inception. In 2008, Channel 5 was added to the list. And the latest review in 2019 by Ofcom added a number of PSB portfolio channels, which also all met the criteria identified in the law. And it's worth noting that the 2019 reform was quite important because it represented the first time that Ofcom considered IPTV-only households, that is to say, those households that only receive TV services through the internet, as opposed to traditional digital or cable or satellite. Ofcom has considered those households for the first time to determine whether a service met the first condition. As the proportion of UK households that have access to traditional broadcast TV will continue to progressively decline, this will put Ofcom's methodology further to test. So as mentioned earlier, the list of events has not seen any drastic changes since 1998. And so what can the data tell us about the state of the UK sports broadcasting market and the impact of the listed events regime? Ampere Analysis, my company, runs a regular survey of nationally representative internet users in 25 markets around the world, including the UK. And among many other questions, we ask respondents to indicate whether they are sport fans and what sports and what individual competitions they enjoy watching on television. So as this chart shows, the Premier League is the most popular sporting event, single event in the UK, with 25% of respondents in our panel indicating that they enjoy watching it. In this table, in this chart, I have highlighted in blue the Group A listed events and in orange the Group B listed events. And as you can see, there are some of the most popular events in the countries that are covered by the listed events regime. And in part, this reflects the national interest that the listed events regime is there to protect, but also in part, it also reflects the effect that free-to-air broadcasting can have on the popularity of an event. But the listed events regime can possibly also have an effect on viewers' willingness to pay for a specific event. So in this chart, on the horizontal axis, you have the same data that you were seeing just before, essentially the proportion of respondents that say they enjoy watching a particular event, the popularity of the event. On the vertical axis instead, you have the proportion of the fans of each individual event that also claim they would be willing to pay for that event. And as you can see, on the top right corner, you have the Premier League, which is the most popular event in the UK, but also enjoys a huge level of, well, let's call it loyalty or willingness to pay by its fans. So about 70% of its fans claim to be willing to pay for that, to watch that event. Listed events of comparable popularity, say the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup, attracts much lower willingness to pay. So let me emphasize that by focusing only on Group A listed events. They fall all under in the sort of bottom right corner of this diagram. So very popular events, but with lower willingness to pay. This is in reflection of the expectations that viewers have grown in relation to the accessibility of these events. Meanwhile, Group B events possibly of comparable popularity possibly have a slightly higher willingness to pay, and again, perhaps in recognition of the fact or reflection of the fact that several of them have in fact been already shown on pay TV platforms for quite some time. And finally, before I hand it back to Ray, I just wanted to note that, of course, it's important to note that the listed events regime can have an effect on the value of the rights themselves because they essentially reduce competition and require certain broadcasting conditions. And so as such, it can be harder for rights holders to achieve growth in the fees that broadcasters pay for these rights, which often make for the vast majority of the overall revenues generated by the sport. So there lies the tension in relation to whether more events should be made available on a free-to-air basis, or at least covered by the listed events regime as it is.
Jack,
sorry. Of course, please.
No, I thought you finished.
I have, yes, of course.
The dangers of remote. Jack, that was a fascinating oversight of a very complex area, but I'm struck by perhaps the most simple thing, startling thing of all, that there's been no basic fundamental change in the system since 1998, and that, as we all know, since then there has been a revolution in communications of an unprecedented nature. Do you think that from the UK perspective further legislation is needed to protect the public interest?
Do I think that?
Yes.
I think it's certainly it's an interesting question, because I think that what the government position on that is that the current regime strikes the right balance between the need for a. I'll put my camera on. My apologies. Between the need for access, wide availability of these popular and sporting events in the national interest, and the commercial freedom that rights holders have to try and grow the revenues that they have and grow the sport and grow investment in grassroots sports. So that will tend to be the arguments that some of the rights holders who fear the impact of further listed events regulation might have on the broadcasting rights and the broadcasting fees that they receive. It's striking, as you say, that it hasn't changed. Nothing has changed in the past 23 years, 25 years. And it seems as if possibly a review of the events that are covered and the extent to which they're covered might be warranted. I mean, there are indeed commercial and strategic considerations to be taken by the rights holder themselves, which may facilitate the free-to-air broadcasting of the events without necessarily further regulation. And this is something that we have explored.
Thank you very much, Jack. And now to Barbara Slater, who obviously listed events are of enormous importance to the BBC, not least there's excellent coverage of Wimbledon, and as a tennis player and fan, I congratulate Barbara Slater on it. But how does she see the current state of play in this very complex area?
Ray, thank you very much. Thank you as well, Jack, for the presentation. And firstly, can I just say how much I welcome this opportunity to come and speak this morning and hopefully raise awareness of some of the issues around listed events, and also look maybe to the longer term and perhaps some concerns and some real jeopardy that we feel is there, and look for support in as to how we can preserve the role that listed events plays, because it has been absolutely crucial in ensuring universal reach and free-to-air access to those pinnacle events that are on the list. So, and I think you only have to look at this summer and see some of the extraordinary audiences that were achieved by events that were listed. If you look at the European Football Championships, overall reach of 44 million. This was an event shared between the BBC and ITV, and the final alone peaking at well over 30 million when you looked at the audiences across those two different broadcasters. So huge impact and huge importance to audiences. And I think there's a number of points I really hope that we can explore and discuss in this session. The first is the qualifying criteria, because it is complex and there is risks. And you actually said it, Jack, didn't you? That this regime is going to be further tested as audiences change from linear to different means of distribution. And we would argue very, very strongly that there is a way of simplifying that and making it clear, and that it should be based on proven reach. Those broadcasters, if you like, whose mission it is to reach the widest possible audience, the PSBs. And we just feel it is incredibly important that the legislation is providing and protecting going forward those broadcasters that deliver the widest possible reach and can prove that they have done so and have a track record in doing that. And we think that that should be enshrined, if you like, or codified in the legislation. We think that that's a really important modernization of the regime that should happen. As you say, we're talking about legislation from the 1990s. It's right that it should be looked at, updated and modernized. And the other point that we would want to make is around on-demand and digital access. Because if I say take the Olympics this summer, we had over 100 million requests for video of the games. And we're increasingly seeing younger audiences access their content digitally, in catch-up, if you like. And we just feel that it is really, really important that we're not creating a digital divide. Listed event legislation was created in a linear age. We are no longer in a linear age. And that would be one of the other really critical points that I really hope that we can explore this morning. Then you were touching upon it in your questions, Ray, to Jack, around that other maybe aspect of modernisation, which is the list itself, and we completely respect that that's a government decision. But one thing we really would want to put to the fore is if you look at the list and you look at the changes that we're seeing in the attitudes towards women's sport, we believe there must be better balance. And that while we do have some events there that obviously you have both men and women competitors, there are no exclusively women's sports events. And just think back to 2019 and the impact of the Women's World Cup coming in from France, and overall a 28 million reach for that tournament, with a semi-final that was the second most viewed television programme of the entire year in any genre, not just sport. Now that is delivering impact, and that is delivering maximum reach. And we just think that those events have traditionally been free to air, that there really is an important moment in time now to protect that going forward. Ray, can I just finish with one final point?
You can.
Rugby League. Honestly, we are delighted that more rugby league is going to be seen on terrestrial television, but we've been doing the Challenge Cup for 50 years, which has included a significant number of live rugby league matches covered on the BBC. Sorry, I just felt I had to.
It's not my sport. I absolutely.
No, but it would be wrong for me not to say that, because, and by the way, rugby league would I really believe acknowledge the important role that the Challenge Cup final has played in promoting the game.
It's the Super League. You're quite right. But listen, you've provided a very impressive shopping list for the future, which we will take forward. But clear up something from the past.
Right.
The BBC was heavily criticised for its relatively limited coverage of the Olympics, certainly compared to what you did in London. People,
I'm very pleased.
Were you fairly or attacked, or this was by people not quite understanding the market?
No, indeed. And I would just pick up, you said, relatively comprehensive coverage. I would actually say, and I accept it was different, but it was still very comprehensive coverage.
It wasn't every sport.
No, it wasn't every sport, but it was 350 hours, more than is humanly possible for anybody to watch in a 17-day period. It was also more hours on BBC One than we have ever done before. And obviously there was a comprehensive digital offering. But you are absolutely right. We did not have the sport by sport streams, which we enjoyed in 2012 and 2016. And I think, again, it's really important to draw it back to the listed event legislation, because there is no protection and no provision in that legislation for IP delivered content and therefore the multiple streams. Indeed, the legislation requires a service, a qualifying service, and it is focused on live. So much of the coverage that we enjoyed from Tokyo, albeit more limited, was still part of a commercial agreement with the Discovery, as you say, who after all invested an enormous amount of money in this. And what we wanted to do was ensure that we had some longevity of coverage. So our agreement with Discovery stretched from the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics and will through to Paris in 2024. And there were a number of things that we really wanted to prioritize. We wanted to prioritize the ability of our primary network to choose whatever and go whenever to whichever sport it needed to tell the best story. And that's not the case across the whole of Europe, and that for us that was incredibly important. We also felt it was necessary to have some choice, so we also negotiated above any listed event regime to have a second channel, and also the ability to do catch up and highlights is also additional. So you're right. I think there was an element where it felt different. And I think that was partly because it was an overnight games. And I don't think we should underestimate the impact that had. So many of those events were overnight. And we were trying to do both a mixture of live and catch up as people were waking up in the morning. So it was different. it unfortunately was necessary because we had to strike a partnership. This is a partnership. Discovery and the BBC share the rights to the Olympics, and we wanted to come up with the best deal that we could, but also respected that we had a paid broadcaster that had invested really significantly in the Olympics.
That clears that up very well. But just briefly, do you want more protection for other streams from major events like the Olympics in a list?
Well, we think that, and again, it is all about balance, that most crucial is on demand. And we actually have a number of events coming up. We're going to have an Olympics from LA, we're going to have an Olympics from Brisbane, and we're going to have a World Cup from the USA, Canada, and Mexico. And given those time differences, we believe it is essential that in terms of accessing the core content, which is exactly what the listed event legislation is there to preserve, to be fit for the future and to be modern, on demand should be in there. And we do believe that there is a way. There are certain provisions now within the listed event regime. For example, with the B list, there's an agreed holdback. So again, I think and Jack, you discussed the balance that needs to be made between the right of commercial organisations, but also preserving those really crucial moments for free to air. And so we would say that there is a way, the same provision for fair and reasonable price, and that should apply to in the digital space as much as it should to effectively the live, or on the B list, the highlights provision.
Barbara, for now, thank you very much indeed, and move on to John Grogan. I suppose you're a former parliamentarian, but from a political perspective, what do you think should happen now?
Well, thanks very much indeed. Firstly, just to say, I'm speaking from Rugby League country here in Yorkshire, and just a quick word about Barbara. Her longevity has been mentioned already. May she go on for many more years yet. If there's two things I think are distinctive about Barbara, is one, at a time of declining money for the BBC, she's used what Jack identified, the power of free-to-air broadcasters to persuade rights holders, not just to show the listed events, but many more sports that it's in their interest. And cricket is a notable example of getting some cricket back on. And it's a similar thing that Channel 4, I think, have done with Super League today, and also women's sport. I mean, it's just completely transformed in the last decade. So I'll just make a few points about the politics then, going on from there. And women's sport, I think, Nicky Morgan, as has been referred to, started consulting on this a couple of years ago. It really is time that we have things like the football female women's World Cup as a listed event, because the BBC and Channel 4 and now ITV are showing some live women's football as well. The danger is that this becomes more and more popular, and then in a few years' time, if it's not listed, it disappears from our screens onto paid TV or subscription. So I think that's quite urgent. Also, if we're looking at additions to the list, the interests of the nations, I think, are important. There was a big furore, anybody a bit north of Yorkshire, but in Scotland the other week, when on the big football qualifying night for the World Cup, England was live on STV and Scotland wasn't. This is, of course, because the English rights are very valuable to ITV, the Scottish rights less so, and they're not protected in any way. So you could grow up in Scotland, and obviously recently they were in the Euros, but that's the first time for a while you could grow up in Scotland and never see your national team live on free-to-air TV because the qualifying matches are not listed. They should be listed, as they are in France and Denmark, all the home nations. And rugby in Wales, that is a really key issue. Unfortunately, the BBC is still showing the Six Nations from Wales. But if ever there's a case for a listing, it's definitely rugby in Wales, whatever happens in the rest of the United Kingdom. Just a couple of other points, just reflecting on the Olympics. And again, I think Barbara played a difficult hand well, but just to go into a little bit of the detail of it, the whole of the Olympics is a listed event. That was Parliament's will. What happened is the BBC got the rights up until Tokyo. They then did a deal with Discovery, who got the rights for the next two Olympics, the Beijing Winter Olympics and the Paris 2024 Olympics. That was a commercial deal. I can see good reason for that. But as we heard from Jack, one of the criteria of the listed events that Ofcom looks at is there has to be an opportunity for the qualifying broadcasters, largely the public service broadcasters, to acquire the full rights to the listed events. That didn't happen with 2022 and 2024. It was a sweetheart deal done with Discovery by the IOC. And this gives a problem for Ofcom, I think, and because normally what you'd expect now is the two broadcasters, Discovery and the BBC, to make an application to Ofcom to show exclusively live together those two Olympics. And Beijing's coming around in a few weeks' time. That's what BBC and TV did with the Euros just recently. So if they're not going to do that, and there's some reason why the Ofcom doesn't expect them to do that, that does put a coach and horses through the listed events legislation, because no public service broadcaster was given the chance to bid for those rights in 2022 and 2024. And Barbara, shall I shut up and let Barbara come back in and answer that?
I just wanted to say that I'm not disagreeing with you, John, but I think it's really worth stressing. The legislation does not provide for IP delivery. There is nothing within the listed event regime that applies to that. And even then, it dictates a service. And everything is, if you like, according to the legislation. And I realize that might not be what people want, but I do think it's really important to say that it is the legislation that does not provide for the multiple streams. And you're right, these were difficult choices. Of course, we would love to be able to kind of carry on, but we have to be aware. And I do think it's worth bearing in mind that we look very carefully at the numbers for Rio and indeed in 2012 about where audiences were getting most of their value from the Olympics. And about 95% of all viewership was through that main linear outlet, if you like, the integrated feed with the best of everything. So given tough choices, I think to make sure that we preserve that very, very critical service that was the most popular to most audience was a priority. But we fully recognize that there were some individual sports that will have gone, well, hang on a minute, our long form coverage isn't available free to air anymore.
John, is there any sense from your parliamentary colleagues? I mean, your involvement in contacts with the Labour Party must be still very extensive. Is there any appetite or indeed realization of some of these very important points for the future that Barbara has raised, or is it just not above their threshold, as it were?
Well, no, I think it's a slow burner. And if you remember, there was a lot of interest at the time of the Olympics. A lot of politicians on all sides commented. And the bill will give a chance when it comes for this to be crystallized. So, for example, to give an example from the past, listed events, as you said in your introduction, it is a niche interest for most of the time, but it can explode onto the parliamentary landscape. For example, some of you remember the late Dennis Howell, and he led a rebellion in the dying days of the Major government. And then the issue was whether the listed events should just exclude pay TV, or whether they should also include pay-per-view, or whether they should also include subscription TV. And he had a rebellion in the dying days, a cross-party rebellion. It was late at night in the House of Lords. Democracy, you might say, at its finest, and then it went back to the Commons, who approved it. So I think it is an issue that it has all the hallmarks of what interests politicians: the role of women in our society, digital rights, and access to big events. We're bidding for the World Cup, for example. The last time we bid for the World Cup in the Gordon Brown government, FIFA were insisting if we give it you, which they never did, of course, if we give it you, you've got to amend your listed events legislation so it's only the England team that is alive on free to air. So there's big power here. FIFA and UEFA have never liked the listed events and so on and things. And so it needs politicians to be interested. And I think we're coming to a time when we have the media bill where it gives a chance to put down amendments. And we've seen in the last few weeks in Parliament the power of putting down amendments.
Indeed, we have. One question has come in from Neil. He doesn't give his second name, but it doesn't matter. It's a good issue. Should radio be included? Radio coverage of sports events be included in to protect coverage from commercial players?
Well, I suppose the reason it hasn't is that radio. I mean, there is a competitive radio market with TalkSport, particularly, you know, on things like boxing and recently rugby and so on. But it is free to. As yet, we haven't gone to any sort of subscription model of radio. So I think that's why politicians have tended to stay out of the radio market. That it's a competitive market that people can access freely. And so it doesn't quite have the same imperative. And I know the BBC have tried to show where there is, when they haven't got access on television, they obviously try, in a public service remit, try and provide access on radio where they can.
And we do, John.
Is there a radio issue for you?
I think John's is right in what he said. There's possibly less of imperative because the issues have not yet arisen. There is a very strong free-to-air market, if you like, for radio rights, and you know, the sort of the subscription model that you're seeing in TV broadcasting has had less impact. Looking in the longer term, I suppose we don't know how that might unfold. So I definitely think it is a very good question and something to consider. And it is worth, as you said, John, just reflecting on the fact that we do exactly that. Where we don't have the TV rights, we do put a particular priority on trying to acquire the radio rights for that event. And something like the Premier League is a really good example of that, where those audio rights are shared between ourselves and TalkSport. And actually that is a fantastic proposition for the listener.
Changing the subject slightly more generally, we've had a comment from Kevin Backhurst of Ofcom, ex-BBC, as you know, and he assures us that Ofcom is looking at all of these issues. Very thoroughly, is this an important way in that Ofcom can create, in a way, a market for a debate, a parliamentary debate and parliamentary progress in all of this?
Well, yes, and we just think these are issues that need to be addressed. I mean, you know, for example, IPT delivered content is not covered by Ofcom, and so, you know, there are US streaming companies that would not come under Ofcom's jurisdiction here, and you know, I just think that should be an industry concern. So no, I absolutely think there's a really important, and there is a moment in time, as John was saying, with the media bill, and these are amendments that are true to the founding principles of listed events. I don't think this is somehow something trying to sort of amend something in a way that is sort of unfair or seeks greater advantage. It's very much about modernizing to preserve what the listed events was always about, and therefore widest possible reach, proven widest possible reach, should be the basis of the qualifying criteria. And we should look at how audiences consume their content, and the volume of content that is consumed on demand, I would say, again, under a sort of the same umbrella provisions, should be included, not just live.
I just add to that. I draw the analogy with Ofcom's role in the debate about prominence, which has been key in recent years in drawing it to the attention of politicians. And there were some indications in the debate about the Olympics and so on that Ofcom hinted in some of their statements that they saw the need to review the law in this area. They weren't more specific than that, but I think it would be a great help to the debate if at some stage in the next 6 months or whatever, Ofcom, perhaps not a specific consultation, but perhaps just as part of someone giving a speech or whatever, could flesh out a little bit more what they would see as the regulator as helpful changes in the law, because now is the time to do it, really.
Yeah.
And there's another one here for Barbara from Professor Steve Bonnet. He's asking Barbara, what happened to the EBU? Did the BBC negotiate unilaterally, and that is that the shape?
No, that's a very, very, I think, worthwhile a point to make. So the IOC, in their, if you like, process, allowed multi-territory bids. So we've been a long-standing, by the way, that's long-standing practice, and we have traditionally, or not on every occasion, but on many occasions and with many events, we acquire rights as part of the EBU. And on occasions, we deal directly with the rights holder, and that's often a rights holder decision and both an EBU decision. So on this occasion, there were pan-European bids via the EBU, and there were pan-European bids, a pan-European bid by Discovery. And of course, that made it very challenging for any individual country, because our bid was within a European bid. And there's no question that there were pressures on some European public service broadcasters that impacted the amount that they could offer. So it wasn't just a question of what could the BBC offer, that was a question of what other European broadcasters could offer as well. And Discovery paid, very sizable rights fee.
Could I go back to Jack and apply your slide rule over the arguments that you've heard? What do you think of the shopping list that's emerging, Jack? Protecting some of the top women's events against future popularity, is it almost, and indeed on demand, and all of these issues. Are these reasonable matters, and is there a reasonable chance that they can be addressed?
Absolutely. I think that in terms of extending the regulation towards on-demand and generally IPTV services, I think that this would just reflect the way in which content and sports in particular are starting to be consumed enormously. So Barbara mentioned obviously that 95% of viewing, or at least it was the main way, broadcast was the main way in which the Olympics were consumed. This was reflected by the IOC, which sort of across all its territories, so less than 10% of consumption of viewing towards OTT. But what is growing is the percentage of people who consume through both broadcast and online. I think it was the IOC that mentioned that about 2/3 of viewers consume something like that. Not only that, our most recent survey of sport fans in the UK shows that about 1/3 of audiences between 18 to 34 prefers content to be streamed rather than broadcast. So it would be a big gap in the regulation if that wasn't addressed. I am not aware of whether changes in the latest AVMSD directive possibly address that in terms of the targeted country, but it's certainly something that should be looked into. And possibly could have a bigger impact than necessarily adding more sports into the list.
And I do think it's just worth reflecting 100 million requests, digital requests over the Olympics. That's an awful lot of people accessing content.
And finally, from you, Jack, I was most intrigued by one of your facts in a report that for sponsors, a free-to-air broadcast across all of Europe can be worth as much as 220,000 euros a minute. I mean, so it's not just pay TV. There's really serious money here from advertising and sponsorship, not available to BBC, of course. But it's a very positive argument for free-to-air television, isn't it?
Absolutely. I touched upon towards the end of my presentation earlier. In fact, we at Ampere have analysed the European sports markets in terms of the direction of travel, the pay TV sector, which has contributed to about 2/3 of the sports spend in the past 10 years or so. So the sports rights market has rested a lot on the dynamics that have affected the pay TV sector, but we all know that the pay TV sector is under increasing challenges from global OTT services. So it's unlikely that further growth in the sports business is going to come from those those providers, it's more likely that other sources of revenues will need to step in to contribute to the growth of the sector, contribute to the growth of the industry. And in that sense, we estimated that indeed, as you said, the impact that free-to-air can have on the value of advertising, of sponsorship, of essentially the brand awareness is immensely higher on free-to-air television than it is on the alternatives to pay TV that often are considered by maybe the rights holders. So the likes of the streaming platforms, which tend to be behind, obviously on subscription, but also have a much lower distribution, much lower take up than traditional pay TV, and indeed free-to-air television across Europe.
Can I go to John and make a heroic assumption that there's a early by-election and you get back in the Commons quite quickly? What would be your priority, obviously in this context, as a new Labour MP?
Well, I'm only 18 months older than Keir Starmer, so it's not that distant a prospect. You never know. You never know the next election. You never know the next election. So I think it would be the digital point, really. And I'd like, if there was one event to add, it would be the Women's Football World Cup and European Championships, I think. So that would be my starting point, I think. But I haven't quite given up on the Ashes tests neither. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And finally to Barbara. Barbara, are you optimistic or pessimistic in the face of these multi-billion companies rampaging the world that the line can hold and that your viewers can continue to receive more sport live, exclusive, not less?
Quite a question. Firstly, can I say, a lot of it will depend upon listed events, because I think we would be in a very different place if we didn't have listed events now. But of course, listed events only protects a relatively limited number of events. And I think what is interesting is going forward, and John mentioned the cricket, and if I could just use the cricket as a really good example. Here was a rights holder that recognised the importance of free-to-air exposure and bundled their rights in a way that allowed for packages that would be available both to pay and free-to-air. And we saw the 100 launch last summer to great success. I mean, a really significant step forward in increasing volume of sport on terrestrial television. And that was done in a partnership with some of those matches available on pay and some of those matches on free to air, with, I think, a real recognition of the value that all parties brought to that arrangement. So I am optimistic. And can I just also highlight next year, if you are a sports fan, are you ready? Starting in February are Winter Olympics. 6 nations shared between the BBC and ITV. The FA Cup shared between the BBC and ITV. Wimbledon, the Challenge Cup final, the 100, some international cricket on TV, a World Athletics Championships, a Commonwealth Games, a European Championships, a Rugby League World Cup. And I apologise if there's an event there that I have missed from this list. And of course, a World Cup to round off the year of Winter World Cup. That's an extraordinary volume of sport. And that is fantastic for viewers, but I think fantastic for sport. The inspirational role models, that accessibility, the ability of sport to lift the spirit of the nation. Didn't we see that during COVID? So a real treat ahead for viewers and listeners.
On that optimistic and inspirational note, I think we'll end. We could do no better. And thanks to you, Barbara, and also to Jack and John. And I hand back now to Colin Brown.